Alrighty. Sounds good. Thank you. Just give me a second to pull this up. Okay. Okay. So you should be able to see it and like me in the corner. All right. Nice. Hello everyone. Um, my name is Umar, and yes, I'm a debater from South Africa. I have debated for quite a few years now. Um, and I graduated a little while ago. So I started in South Africa, and then I debated for a while in England, where I finished my master's at UCL. And since then, I've just graduated. I still do some debating here and there, but primarily, while I've been debating for a long time, I think the content of this lecture is something that I've always struggled with. So I was sort of given some guidance on where to engage you guys today on this idea of creating clarity, and then also specifically focusing on whips, because I understand you're going into the AP season. So for third speakers, it could be really useful. I want to note that like in preparing this session, I sort of stumbled across, and even getting some of your questions, I sort of stumbled across the idea that like a lot of this is they're like general guidelines of how to approach judging and how to get clarity from rounds and also whip speaking. There are no golden rules that make you exceptionally good at whip speaking, or an exceptionally good judge. Instead, what there are guidelines. And over time, what will happen is you will fine tune through your experience, through the amount of time you spend debating. You will fine tune your individual ability to do these things. So, the session is to some extent a little bit general, because the questions are quite broad. But I do hope that you're able to get something from it. And also apologies, like it starts off really pretty, but it gets progressively less so because I run out of like cool icons to use. But before we start, I just want to ask if you wouldn't mind in the chat just giving me an idea of, how long you've been debating for. So I just have a bit of an idea of the level of experience of the people who are here with us today. So maybe you can just like say your name and how long you've been debating for, just to give me a bit of insight. Um, that really helps me in terms of pitching the session. So, like my name is Umar. I've been debating for 10 years, that sort of thing. It'd be great. If you want, you can throw your university title or like what you study. That'd be really nice. So like, I studied urban design. Now I work as a researcher in Sierra Leone, in West Africa. So, any details would be great. Awesome. Okay, wow. So we have a lot of experienced people, a number of years. Yeah, wow. I mean, the smallest amount of time is 2 years. So yes, super, super experienced group of people. All right, excellent. Well, it's lovely to have you here. It's lovely to have people with this level of experience. Oh, nice. Nice. Love to see a South African. Fantastic. Alrighty. So let's get into it. And the one thing I'll say is just that, like, while this is obviously like to some extent a presentation, I really appreciate the people chiming in with questions when they have them. So if you have any questions, just let me know when you have them, and then I'll be happy to chat about them. So let's get right into it. So yeah, section one. Oh, yeah, section one. Uh, And I think before we get into that, it's just the idea of like what we really need to discuss, which is this that like the reality is most debates, especially debates outside of, the best of the best rooms, are incredibly messy. Teams or the vast majority of teams don't really engage directly. And so this is more giving you a bit of context for, that creating that clarity as a judge, being able to disentangle complex debates. Teams do not really engage directly. Oftentimes, individuals will make parallel arguments, and more than that, teams will fail to compare impacts. And so this leads to a situation where teams never really explain why they win, and judges are forced to then step into the debate and resolve the debate themselves. This is generally something that, is a sort of high risk strategy. Like if you don't guide or provide an evaluation technique for the debate, you're very much leaving it in the hands of a judge, which, judges are often, often good, but often quite inexperienced. And so it really leads you to be in a very precarious situation. Let's talk about and so this presentation is sort of structured in a little bit of time spent for judges and a little bit of time spent of debaters. The reason why the judging section comes first is once you understand the sort of metric and framework that you approach judging debates and what what reasonably you can expect from a judge. It gives you a lot more power, especially as a whip speaker. So that's why the judging section comes first. So let's talk about your core responsibility as a judge. Ideally, you have to answer one question. Which team did more to justify winning? And I want to focus on one word here, which is justify, right? How can you create a justifiable verdict that when teams ask you, you can provide substantiation for? So it's not which team sounded better. It's not which team said more. It's quite strongly that judging is comparative and it's not descriptive. Why do debates become more difficult to judge? The first thing here is that teams fail to explain what matters most. I also said this a little bit earlier, they fail to compare impacts and they fail to justify victory. This creates a massive amount of uncertainty. And so I want to focus and speak about legitimate versus illegitimate intervention as a judge. And this is sort of explicitly what was asked of me in terms of like guiding. And I think it's the thing that we struggle the most at in judging. Even quite recently at the World Championship in Sofia, I was very fortunate enough to judge one of the final rounds, the EFL final. And in that final, we had a panel of 9 judges, presumably some of the better judges at the tournament. And we really struggled in the end to come to consensus because we couldn't really decide what was legitimate versus illegitimate in terms of intervention. And so the thing I'll say here is what I'm going to give you is a guidance of what these things are. But oftentimes, what we think of as legitimate, are sort of predefined by our lived experiences, the amount we know about the world, etc. So the first thing, or the first bit of guidance we need to talk about, is that you should never invent arguments. So when teams are giving claims, do not supplement them by inventing additional argumentation. More than that, you don't add impacts that might be intuitive to you but never explicitly stated. You have to judge quite explicitly only on the arguments presented, and then obviously work on comparing the argumentation that exists. This is a relatively simple slide, but I think it's really, really important in sort of setting up this sort of delineation. Here is where we think that there is a clear level of intuition as to what could be claimed, and here is where we think it is illegitimate. And I think I find more and more as you're a judge who becomes more experienced, as you're put in more situations where you have to chair rounds, and especially if you're chairing rounds at larger tournaments, oftentimes with inexperienced judges or inexperienced panels, this is a really, really good tool for being able to streamline the discussion, for being able to put yourself in a position where, as a chair, you can say, this is what we think is reasonable in terms of in terms of us stepping into this debate and defining what is legitimate, and this is what we think is illegitimate. So bear in mind this framework when it comes to chairing, especially. The next thing that came up in preparation of this is how to identify real clashes, and especially in debating these days, that is becoming increasingly complex. You have really, really large cases with massive, massive amounts of individual claims and really, really complex argumentation, focusing on, firstly, what are the direct disagreements within teams, and then specifically understanding that not all arguments matter equally. And then here you have to find the questions that determine the winner. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In a debate where you're speaking about, for instance, and I think we have an example later on around universal basic income, if a team claims that, for instance, that UBI provides some level of like welfare assistance and therefore a level of like uplifting from poverty, and the opposition describes it as one, ineffective as a welfare mechanism, and two, a drain on state resources, like obviously here, while not like super direct, there is a claim on whether or not this provides sufficient welfare. So as a judge, you can identify that as clash point and be able to use that later on in evaluating how the debate plays out. I think this slide is slightly more difficult to really substantiate, because comparative analysis is something that everyone tries, but oftentimes people do not really do. So in terms of comparative analysis, what I mean here is that you should generally try to reward teams that compare things explicitly and do a significant amount of weighing on their direct impacts. When they do this, firstly, they give us a metric for judging, and I think it allows you to some extent, reward those teams for making your judging a little bit easier because they've done the work. But here, quite importantly, you should not ever judge or reward the quantity of arguments alone. This is somewhat relevant as an element of debates. So before we go into the next session, which is focusing on the whip speeches specifically, I want to talk about two guiding ideas that I think I found really useful. And this is where I sort of made some notes. So I'll just read off my phone here, and what I'll do is I'll add them to the slides later and send them to you. when you're evaluating or in a position where you're in a high room and you have uh, what we call like, sort of a situation of chaos where you have the vast majority of teams um, not really agreeing on what the comparative is. We have a vast majority of teams disagreeing on where the impacts lie. How are you able to step into that debate as a judge and to conduct the deliberation? The first thing there, the first thing to do here is as the debate is going, you really, really need to focus on note taking. So if you get to a deliberation that is not unanimous and you have a significant amount of disagreement, the first tool that will assist you in making the correct decision is having a high level of notes on the debate, especially for deliberations that go long. So when you have, out rounds, especially when you have deliberations that go for, sometimes 30, 40, even an hour, um, what happens is people start to change the arguments. People start to draw ideas that were never really explicitly stated. So by having strong notes, by putting yourself in a position where you're able to recall quite directly, this is the thing that that team said, here is where they do the impacting. It gives you a very strong baseline to push forward for obviously the justification that you believe in. And this is a tool that I think is underrated because most of us, we start debating, we develop a very, intuitive note-taking style for ourselves, and then we sort of stop improving the efficiency of that note-taking style. So I myself, for instance, I've never been someone to use a laptop for my note-taking. I prefer to do it on paper because it allows me a little bit more flexibility. I realized after years of debating that I was still only using two pieces of paper, and it was significantly limiting the amount of information that I could capture on speeches, especially for like very high impact rounds with very good teams, because the amount of paper that I was using was simply not enough space. And so it was really simple. I just got a few more pages, and it significantly gave me more freedom to take better notes. And I found more and more when I stepped into deliberations, I was able to provide more concrete justifications. So the first bit of advice on how to create clarity and resolve these really complex rounds is to focus on your note-taking style and try to, and this is a relatively boring bit of advice, but super high impact. Spend some time trying to create more efficiency in that. If you're note-taking on a computer, make sure you're doing it in such a way that you're capturing like ideas fully. I know a lot of people have also started, especially people who note take on computers, have started to essentially transcribe speeches. So basically write them down verbatim. And I think this has its pros and cons, but I would strongly discourage this. I think, again, what would be a better tool is to focus on listening to the speech and then distilling. So don't transcribe the speech. Instead, try to do paraphrasing and try to actually note arguments as they're explained, not so much like word for word. And I know that is a subtle distinction, but it's more important to capture, the nuance of the argumentation as it is delivered, as opposed to every single word. And oftentimes, I find if you're solely focused on transcribing the speech, you will miss the subtle elements of the subtle impacting, etc. You will be able to, if I'm honest with you, it always makes debates less enjoyable if I focus solely on my note taking. I understand that it's very difficult for a lot of newer judges to deal with the amount of matter that is delivered by really good debaters, but it's a skill that is developed over time. So it's something that with practice you will really fine tune and be in a significantly better position to step into. Outside of note taking, let's talk about how you justify or how you disentangle debates as a member of a panel in a complicated round. And I think this is, for me, a skill that I did not really develop at the beginning of my career. And I found in absence of it, I was quite useless, especially in rooms where there was not consensus. I would often find myself looking at my notes, but not being able to contribute effectively. So my first bit of advice here is that you should really focus on stepping into the oral adjudication, not just with like a first to fourth ranking, but a high level summary of each case. And again, this is something that you should do as the debate is progressing. What I do is in the 1 to 2 minutes that each speaker is like called up to the podium, is preparing their notes. What I try to do in that time is I try to go really, really in depth into my notes and highlight and disentangle what are the core claims there. And what that does is that I'm able to establish a short summary of each speech as the debate is progressing, and use that later on in the deliberation to provide really high level summaries. I want to note that when you're in like rounds where there isn't consensus, oftentimes time is really precious. So being able to, firstly, not take a huge amount of time to go through your notes because you already have case summaries prepared, but more than that, being able to deliver those summaries with nuance. It's the worst feeling when you have, for instance, your chair gives you 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe a minute at the start of deliberation to give your ranking, or maybe explain it the diagonal, and then you do that, and then you realize, oh, I've forgotten a really important bit of the case that was really crucial for my justification, but was obviously not brought up by me. And so being able to really focus on delivering with efficiency your viewpoint can not only aid the discussion, but can also significantly contribute to convincing people of your position. So note taking again lends to that significantly. The last thing is, once you've got your note taking, once you're able to do the summaries, how do you just deal with complicated debates? How do you deal with debates where people or teams are making completely opposing claims and you are not sure what is legitimate or illegitimate? And I think I gave you the guideline a little bit earlier, but I want to break it down more thoroughly. The first thing to ask yourself is genuinely like within the scope of this debate, is something a natural or reasonable point to draw downstream from this? And this will lead sort of into our idea of the whip speech. That's why I want to speak about it as we transition into that section. What I mean by that is that oftentimes debaters will intuit something, but not complete an argument. And so you need to become really, really rigorous in holding people very liable for exactly what they say. And so just note that intuitions are in and of themselves not concrete matter or argumentation. They are instead tools that supplement argumentation and analysis. So, in the absence of that explicit argumentation, you should feel quite comfortable as a judge to say, this was not proven, this was not delivered at a level that we deem sufficient. And I do think, especially as a judge, when you are in that position of chairing, when you're in a position where more and more you will find yourself in increasingly competitive rooms with debaters who really don't like to lose, the ability to say, quite reasonably, the panel did not feel that this was provided sufficiently is a really strong way to tell a debater, I understand what you're trying to convey, but unfortunately, it was not delivered at a level that we deem sufficient. And why this is an important tool for you as a judge, as someone who will chair rounds, is in absence of taking a strong stance on whether something is accepted or not accepted. Oftentimes, people will try to delegitimize your decision and put you in a position where they feel as if, oh, this was a bad judge. Oh, this judge didn't do the work to do that. And so I think being able to say quite strongly, and this also goes down to your deliberation and whoever your chair is, or if you are the chair,
I think Umar currently has some bad internet. We can just wait for him to rejoin and then we can continue with the lecture.
sorry about that. Alrighty, let's jump back into it. So I think if I'm not mistaken, I was talking a little bit about giving an example of an instance where, for instance, stepping into deliberation where I had firstly very strong note taking, um, and really strong panel of judges judging with me, I was still unable to come to a really strong consensus and had a really difficult time disentangling what is an illegitimate and legitimate intervention or evaluation. This was when I was judging the semifinal of Panama Worlds. It was a really, really exceptional semifinal on this house. I think the motion was this house would military intervene in Sudan. And ultimately, in a panel of 7 judges, we weren't able to, I think it was 7 judges. I think there was a split of 5-2, which I was in the minority of. And I think ultimately what it came down to was after near an hour of discussion, it was very difficult for us. While we agreed on the core claims of the debate, we really had different interpretations of the end impact and whether or not it was a reasonable impact to draw. Specifically, the disagreement was about whether or not, for instance, United Nations intervention would reasonably lead to positive development within Sudan. And if you know what I'll sort of say about the situation was, despite there being in that room, the vast majority of us on that panel had judged outrounds at Worlds, had a number of years of judging under our belts. Some people had even been like Worlds finalists on the panel. There was still a really like a complete inability for us to gauge specifically the impact of this argument. And so this is where I have to, give you the bit of like, the bit of advice that is very frustrating, which is that a lot of judging at the highest level comes down to evaluating the individual impact and whether or not you deem certain ideas to be to be realistic. And so I think the strongest piece of advice I can give to you as someone who is judging more and more is to push yourself to read more about the world and to have a strong and robust understanding of how systems work. Because in absence of that understanding, debaters will just lie to you. They will sell you very, very strong, good sounding lies, and you will have very little ability to disentangle whether or not that is the truth. And specifically, as for instance, like I'm someone who grew up in Southern Africa, and Africa in general, and for a lot of the global South, for a lot of minority groups, oftentimes people sell, and especially in debates, sell what is, a stereotypical version of those places or those experiences. And for you to be able to be, as a judge, to step in and say, this is reasonable, this is within the purview of the average intelligent voter, or the, what we think is legitimate, requires a robust understanding of the world, requires a robust understanding of systems of being. And so the last bit of advice I'd give you on how to decipher complex debates is to read extensively, to push yourself to fill your analytical locker as a debater with a robust knowledge of the world. By doing that and just having, and it doesn't need to be the deepest understanding in the world, but just an understanding of the world, you will significantly improve your ability to step in and create certainty. When you can say, quite like, the vast majority of debates are about things that have happened in the world, or things that are ongoing. By having that baseline knowledge, you will be the person who can step in and say, this is what the average intelligent voter knows, this is how the system works, and as a result, this is a reasonable claim and not a reasonable claim. This is a dangerous bit of advice I give you, but it's something that you will fine tune over time. The more you read, the more you debate, the more you travel, the more you learn in your degree program, the more you will become someone who can actually create that clarity and step in. And the more you will be trusted to be chair judges, the more you will be trusted, hopefully, to judge out rounds at the biggest tournaments in the world. So that's the last bit of advice in that section. And maybe this is a good opportunity to just ask if there are any questions specifically on how to create clarity and how to disentangle those complicated debates. Any questions before we move on to the second section of this session? Okay, doesn't seem like there are any, but that's okay. I think this is a relatively non-controversial section of the presentation. So I want to transition into the whip speech section. The reason I think this session was structured the way it was is there is a strong level of overlap between the performance of a whip speaker and the ability of a judge to actually have a lot of clarity. And that's because the whip creates maximum clarity, I'd like to say. Oftentimes, it is the speech that decides the debate. And for me specifically, as someone who, for the vast majority of my debate career, I was a whip speaker when I did 3v3 and when I eventually moved to BP, it tells the judge how to evaluate the round. So let's work through that. And what I've done here is I think I said wielding whips as a weapon. So I've sort of fashioned like 4 or 5 weapons that I think are really useful to use as whip speaker. And I want to note there's obviously some difference in how you approach whip speeches in British parliamentary versus 3v3 styles like AP or Australs. But the vast majority of advice can sort of be taken at face value. There are some nuances, and I'll point those out where they come up. So the biggest myth about the whip is that the whip summarizes the debate. To some extent, this is true, but for me, the reality is that the whip decides how arguments play out. They decide where the line in the sand is that this debate is ultimately worked on. And again, here, the whip creates decision clarity. Specifically, you'll notice especially in 3v3 debates, I think the whip has a tremendous amount of power. You have so much time to do not so much direct refutation, but respond to cases holistically, that for me, it is a role that, if done poorly, is almost impossible to win a debate, especially in 3v3 styles. So let's talk about strong versus weak whips. Weak whips are just reiterations. They said this, we say this. Strong whips say, or specifically here, boil down the debate to easy to understand, easy to track, and because they're easy to track, easy to have a judge note them down and ultimately redeliver those things later on. So here, for instance, like making decisive claims, the debate comes down to 2 questions and we win both, is an incredibly strong way to guide the intuitions of a judge towards 2 ideas and then provide a strong level of understanding on why you win those. Let's focus a little bit more on the individual things you might want to do. The first thing here is identify key clashes. Um, then specifically go a little bit deeper than those key clashes and identify what specific argumentation you delivered to win them. And then I think zooming back out to explain why this means you win the debate and specifically why your speech is the one that decides the outcome. So let's talk about a few weapons. The first weapon is what I like to call like the collapse technique, which is just that like you view their case as, for instance, like a chair with four legs. And what you try to do is you try to win two or three decisive clashes, and by winning them clearly, you put yourself in a position to destabilize the entire case of the opposition. So in the same way, if you remove two or three legs from a chair, it's impossible for that chair to be stable. It really is a strong tool, but it requires quite a significant trade-off. It requires focusing quite significantly in terms of time on one or two cases, and it limits your ability to speak to other teams. So especially in BP, this can be quite a risky strategy. It's normally something you kind of only want to do if you have a team that is, if you're already second in terms of your positive matter. And so here, like, yeah, I'll give you again a weak and a strong example. A weak example would be that, you know, you have four clashes in a debate about, like, so for instance, this house believes um, this house believes that the state should provide mental health support. A weak word would be that, like, you know, you attempt to win on mental health, you attempt to win on why the state should provide this, and then you provide maybe arguments on why this could like create additional businesses or something. A strong whip here would instead focus on the value of the provision of mental health care, and then just try to win on that one clash. And this, what it does for you is, firstly, it gives you more time to disentangle complex argumentation, but also offers the opportunity of rebuilding. So note that like oftentimes as a whip, and you know, especially within the scope of PP, whips have been empowered significantly in how much they can provide. You can provide new examples, new weighing, and anything that is can be viewed as a reasonable extension of something provided in your member speech. So you have an incredible amount of power if you choose to use the collapse technique to provide additional framework and ultimately build up the case significantly. So I would encourage you to use this technique if you're in a situation where you think you're winning, or you think you're in a position, um, not, when you think that you're in a position where you have a single team ahead of you in BP, or I mean, again, it works really well in 3v3 because you only have one team to beat. And if you choose that two or three more important elements of the case, you can put yourself in a very strong position. Let's talk about framing and framing as a weapon. And this, I think, is a super underrated skill, and it's one that I find probably the most fun. A lot of debaters view framing only as a tool to be used in the first speech, where you speak about this is how the world is, this is what the debate is about. These are some definitional claims that we're going to make. In my opinion, framing is a tool that should be continuously used throughout the debates. And by doing so, especially if a team is not particularly knowledgeable about the content of the debate, if they lie, if they provide incorrect information or incorrect framing, you now have the ability to set the record straight. So on a base level, framing is defining what the debate is about so that you can control how arguments are evaluated. For me, framing is the way in which we can define what matters. So let's go back and I'll give you an example of here where I think framing is really important. Say the motion is about this house would support the implementation of universal basic income. And the opposition framing is that like this debate is about economic efficiency. If the prop comes up and speaks more specifically about this debate being a way for UBI to guarantee human basic dignity, you can step in and as a whip speaker say, as the whip speaker of the proposition, say, this debate is about solving for structural poverty, not marginal economic efficiency, but fundamentally a restoration of human dignity. Universal basic income is the tool through which we can accomplish those two objectives. In a way, what you do here is you sidestep, you know, what is a very fair and reasonable criticism of economic efficiency, and you reframe the debate to focus on the fundamental elements of fundamental elements of importance that support your side in the proposition. And I think especially here, as debating is becoming more international, you find more and more we find debates about, for instance, like you know, lesser known countries, lesser known crises, lesser known areas of the world. And what that means is oftentimes people will provide incorrect substantiations or characterizations of this place. oftentimes entire countries are boiled down to one or two ideas. So I mean, you as the vast majority of you being Korean debaters, even though Korea has a massive amount of um, of weight on the global stage, oftentimes there is not a nuanced understanding of the individual elements of Korean social identity, Korean politics, etc. And so, for instance, taking time to reframe, provide clarity, and provide a deeper framing of something. And I think an example that comes to mind that maybe is applicable is let me find this example. Let me find this motion. So I think it was about 2 years ago. Yeah, within the scope of the Euros preparation for Glasgow, in one of the pre-Euros tournaments, there was a motion about a social movement, or like I think it's called the 4B movement, which was something that I think was prevalent at the time, might still be prevalent within Korea. And I think what happened quite strongly was that debaters would take two or three ideas that they might know, for instance, about like maybe beauty standards in Korea, and cross apply knowledge to make broad sweeping claims around the support or why they were against the 4B movement. Quite importantly here, framing, and especially for me in that debate, like I do not know a tremendous amount about Korea, but I do know a little bit, and I just was able to take pause and just ask for clarity, like, are these reasonable questions to be making assertions about? So like, is it reasonable to make a claim around how beauty standards would directly interface into a movement or directly provide a reason why a movement would be important? So framing, while something like framing, the only way to get better at it really is that thing I said earlier about like reading, filling your analytical locker. One of my first debate coaches when I was in high school said to me that the the most important thing to remember about debating is it is on a fundamental level a reading sport. The more you understand about the world, the better you will be able to perform, and the more you will be able to win. And so once you understand that debating is a reading sport, you understand the importance of developing knowledge about every single place. I would encourage you as a debater who would like to perform well, and especially as a whip speaker, to quite actively engage in matter filing. And when I say matter filing, I don't mean like writing a document with knowledge. I mean pursue knowledge actively and then take that knowledge and distill it down into a document. So the way I do it is that, for instance, if I find an interesting idea, I make a note of it on my phone, and maybe 2 or 3 times a week, even if because I'm not really debating competitively anymore. When I was debating competitively, I would maybe do this. I would dedicate like 2 or 3 hours a week to just matter filing, which was just me going to that note on my phone. And maybe, for instance, I was thinking about that motion from that tournament. I would research the 4B movement, or I would research. I think recently I've been researching a lot about like the UK political system, trying to understand like how specific like council delegations are and districts are created. So that sort of stuff, like while it sounds completely arbitrary, if you do that every day for the entirety of your career, you find yourself in a position where you understand you have such strong basic understanding of the world that you become really good at this technique of framing. To be honest with you, it's the thing that I value the most about my debating skills is I have a really strong ability to reset an argument or reset how a judge is considering the debate. And especially if you're in a bad position, if you're on the back foot in a debate, reframing can give the judge take a second to pause and put you back into the game, which is really important. Characterization is sort of a parallel technique to framing. Characterization is fundamentally your attempt to define how the judge sees an opponent's case. It exposes assumptions and weaknesses, as well as reduces the opponent's credibility. The why I think this is a particularly effective technique is the tendency right now is for people to construct 10 layered cases, like a case with 10 layers, and four of them are just absolute nonsense. They're completely unsubstantiated, and oftentimes they are like really important to the impacts drawn later on. So characterization gives you a really, really strong ability to step in and say, okay, is this something that has been reasonably proven? And so let me give you an example. Um, how you would go about doing this is saying something like, uh, and let's go back to the UBI motion. So in the opposition, a really good way to employ characterization is that you can speak about how, or say something to the effect of, this entire case operates on the assumption that governments implement policies perfectly. However, they never prove the ability of a government to reasonably implement the system, and therefore it is unclear as to whether or not they reach their impact. Another example is that you can claim that UBI only works under ideal situations, but the real world with significant complexities, um, you could, for instance, illustrate how in countries most likely to illustrate or implement UBI, there is a high level of illegal migration, individuals living outside of the legal system, and as a result, they would struggle to benefit from these sort of social welfare programs. Here, by doing this, you can reduce the credibility of opposition's arguments and quite neatly step in and poke holes. Um, the the fact of the matter is, this is not super useful for 3v3 formats because in 3v3 you have more time to step into cases and do more in-depth argumentation. I think this weapon is for me not super useful, but in British parliamentary, I find this a really good way to make sure that you always at least come second because you can definitely beat your opposition bench. Maybe you lose to your opening or your closing, but you can definitely beat your opposition bench. All right, let's move on to another one. Let's move on to weapon four, which is just direct comparative analysis. And this is like, I know this is what a whip should do, and I know it sounds strange to phrase this as like a technique, but it is becoming increasingly, common that people do not actually do direct, explicit comparative analysis. So, for instance, people just say, we solve this harm. But they don't step in and go deep and say, we solve the harm more reliably than they do, then bring in their contrasting argument. So, for instance, if the motion was something like legalizing drugs, a weak argument is that like the proposition saying we reduce crime. A strong whip argument is that, also so saying that like they reduce crime. Um, a stronger whip would say that like they reduce crime marginally. We can eliminate black markets. We can remove the root cause of crime. Therefore, we quite strongly provide a justification of how there is a meaningful reduction in the amount of illegal activity and therefore crime associated with drugs. Importantly, why I've phrased this as this tool is just because it's fallen out of fashion. Um, I think I'm trying to think of a round that I could point you to where I think people did really well. Actually, the round I spoke about earlier, which was the Panama semifinal, I think semifinal two. It had Oxford, it had the winning team. I forget what champions team. I think they were Dartmouth, and then it has two Australian teams. By that, hopefully you can find it. I would really encourage looking over that round because that debate had, firstly, a really strong example of characterization and framing. The closing government team, which is the team that I actually split for, had a really strong stepping in, just saying, this is the reality of Sudan. These are the militias that exist. This is reasonably what we think that they are doing. This is what we reasonably think would be the response to military intervention. I think it's an excellent example of characterization and framing, but more than that, I think it's also a really good example of comparative analysis. If you want to see a strong example, please go watch the Panama semifinal two, I think it is. Um, let's go to the next weapon, which is just explicit ballot justification, which is a technique that I learned as a kid. But I also just think it's like really useful when you have messy rounds. But the thing is, it's really dangerous. So the reason why I say it's dangerous is that you cannot be flippant. Like you cannot just tell judges you win, right? You need to go a little bit deeper and you have to be really sincere and you have to be very realistic. You have to be honest. You have to say, there are a number of arguments in this debate. Here's why the ones we win on matter the most, and the ones that we don't matter. The reason why this is important is, when you're in competitive rooms, the judges are competent, they're experienced, they've been debating for a number of years. You can lie to some of the people on the panel, but you cannot lie to a good judge. And so, by firstly being honest, being sincere, and giving them a reasonable and honest framework to evaluate this debate, you'll probably put yourself in a position where, firstly, if you're honest, they're more likely to give you a little bit of grace where you haven't met the burden of your argument. But also, more explicitly, it gives judges the tools to justify if they believe that you won later on in the debate. They can say explicitly, the whip brings us this criteria, they flag these arguments, and therefore it's easy for us to establish this argument has been made conclusively and this impact has been drawn. Super simple skill, but it is the combination, and I think that's the sort of the last whip weapon that I've brought. It is the amalgamation of all of these five whips that give you the ability to deliver a strong whip over time. And it's the thing that I think is significantly missing right now. The vast majority of people are just implementing one or two. But I also want to give you a bit of advice around strategic implementation of whips. And that is to say that as a whip, sometimes, and a lot of the questions that were forwarded to me by Jill came through were actually about like, how much time should I spend on this versus this? How much time should I prioritize on that or X or Y? The real difficulty, right, is that I cannot give you a standard rule because in each debate, there is a significant difference in the quality of matter, in the amount of matter, in the individual round dynamics, right? So, for instance, in a BP round where you're trying to beat three teams, I cannot give you a standard rule because oftentimes you need to shift the amount of effort you or time you space on refutation versus summary based on how you're doing in the round. If your extension is incredibly debate winning, then you can focus significantly more on reputation, rebuttal, or refutation. You need to actually be able to develop that skill as a judge over time or as a whip speaker over time. Yeah, so I'm going to go into the final two slides here. Um, and I'll conclude before we move into a little bit of time for questions. So the thing I want to speak about here for judges, the final takeaway for judges, is that you should resolve debates. You should find the matter within them, but you should not seek to repair them. Don't step in and individually create greater level of solvency for people. Instead, note the arguments, and through your understanding of the world and through your understanding of what the average intelligent vote is, use that to justify the debate. Compare arguments and reward clarity where it is. In terms of takeaways for debaters, and specifically those who are speakers, collapse the debates to those key clashes, frame the debate, compare explicitly, and justify the valid to the judge. And ultimately, I think you will be in a very strong position through a combination of those three things. The final thing here, or my final thought that I have, is that debates are largely won by teams that make judging easy. And I would say that especially in 3v3, I find the whip to be the most powerful speech, not the most important by any stretch of the imagination, but the most powerful. It's the speech that can bring you back from the brink of defeat and can very strongly lead you to a sort of undeniable victory. But it is the speech that needs to be used, very, very strategically and very decisively. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop, and I'm going to start off by working through the questions that I was sent. But in the meantime, if you do have questions, if you have anything that you want to chat about, please let me know in the chat space. Or actually, I mean, you can also just put up your hand and we can just talk. That would be a bit nicer as well. Yes, Elliot.
In 3v3 debates, is it ever too late for Whip to reframe or recharacterize?
To reframe and recharacterize, you say?
Yeah.
No, it's never. Like also, okay, just so wait. When I say reframe and recharacterize, I don't mean like completely shift the debate to a new place, right? It's more about providing additional clarity. And it's just like so the issue is that people view framing in an incomplete manner. And so when they provide the initial framing for the debate, they firstly either lie or they oversimplify and they don't add enough nuance. So reframing and recharacterization are not providing new or different ones. It's instead providing additional nuance and clarity. So in that sense, it's something that is never too late to do, as long as you're in a position where you're telling the truth. Listen, okay, sometimes you can lie also, but like if you're gonna lie, you need to lie in such a way that it's not something. Okay, actually, don't lie. Sorry, that's bad advice. It's not something I encourage. If you're gonna reframe, it just needs to be just ironclad. Like it needs to actually provide clarity. So it's not something you should do haphazardly. I've noticed also, especially in 3v3, a lot of people are like, oh, this team missed the debate or they missed this clash. It's very unlikely if you have a good opposition that they're actually missing things significantly. So it's a significantly more powerful tool to acknowledge what they bring and then just say it simply isn't detailed enough. It simply isn't framed well enough. It simply isn't characterized well enough. Here's where I'm providing that additional clarity. And in that sense, it is a refutation tool. And so it's perfectly well placed wherever you need it in the web speech, especially in 3v3, in my opinion. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, no worries. If you want to type up the questions, but while people do that, I will just answer the questions that were sent to me. The first question was, how do we know if we should focus on destructive material against the other side, or if we should focus on whipping the extension more? I sort of subtly spoken about this, but to be more explicit, the first thing to say is that it depends very much on the strength of the extension in BP. If your extension is well developed, if it is delivered comprehensively, then obviously you need to spend less time on it. However, if your opposition side spends time doing direct refutation, then you need to whip the extension. It is my opinion that the answer is that you have to do both incredibly well to win the debates. But and that's if you want to win. If you want to just come second, then you really just need to focus on one or the other. And this is something you should make an individual evaluation on a case by case basis. Like an example is that like 2 years ago, I was speaking at yeah, 2 years ago, I was speaking at LSE Open and it was round five. I knew we needed a second to break, and I knew we were not going to come first because the team that had the first was just way, way, way better than us. I had a significantly stronger understanding of like Chinese economic policy, and we were in closing. I stood up. I sidelined all of my instincts to be like stylistic and to do anything, and I focused solely on destructive rebuttal. And I just went line by line in the entirety of the government bench, and we easily took a second, like really strongly took a second with really good speaks. And there, it's a strategic evaluation of like how comfortable are we as a team? What do we need in this round? Can we beat this other team? Being honest and being realistic about where you're sitting in a round is a super powerful tool that most debaters just don't do. They make poor strategic decisions because they don't know where they are in the round. And just understanding, okay, I need a sec, and I think we broke quite high at the LSU, but I think we broke like sixth or something. And if we had fought that round or third, we would have maybe would have broken last on speaks. And so it's that sort of case by case basis that I'd ask you to evaluate as to whether or not you focus on destructive or whipping. The next question we have was, how do you strategically deal with all clashes in a contentious round while simultaneously defending your member's extension? The answer is that you need to focus on summation as a skill. The vast majority of items within your speech, when you're constructing your case, should be, so it's what I call case synergy. When you're developing your case with your member speaker, you should focus on having really strong headlines that are very easy for you to bring back as a whip. So if the argument is on universal basic income and you're the whip, and like your first argument is just on like preservation of human dignity, just have a good headline for that, and then use that you use that effectively at the whip speech. And it's so stupid, but like if you just use the same words and the same headline as your member speaker, all what happens is subconsciously the judge is going to bring back all of that analysis in their mind. So that's how you can strategically bring all of the information that you do while also defending your member's extension. And then you just work through the clashes. But also, to be honest with you, your case probably engages in the clashes anyway, so you can just integrate your responses. So by dealing with the clashes, you can just defend it. So you say, this is the clash, here's where our extension plays in, second clash, our extension plays in. So integration of the refutation into your clash summaries is a really good way to do that. The third question, we have four, so there's only two more. The third question is any tips on how to form good rebuttals that hit home to judges, possibly a template for good rebuttal, and how would you split your time between rebuttals and giving out points? I think I've answered the second half about rebuttal and giving out points. So I'm going to focus on the first bit, which is just like tips on forming good rebuttals that hit home with judges. This is like, I love this question because it's my favorite thing to do. The first thing is like, you just need to, it's a really important skill to be able to gauge your judge's response to your ideas. Judges come from places, they have their own biases, they have their own lived experience. And so it's really important to try and like listen to their body. Like, oftentimes judges will like frown or like, they'll write a lot or they won't write a lot. You can pick up subconsciously whether or not a judge is engaging with what you're speaking about. And so for instance, if you think that if a judge is not writing or is not really focused or like looking out the window, focus and bring back their attention, speak a bit louder, bring them back with some really strong ideas. In terms of destructive rebuttal, my number one tool, and this is something that I do is my, I think, the best idea. You should just be honest and you rebut sincerely. Judges love when you engage honestly and sincerely with opposition's cases. And if you are like faithfully retelling what a case is before rebuttaling it, teams will be so like, people cannot just stand up and say, oh, you're not doing this or you're not doing that. The strongest tool is, let me give you the template that you asked for, is you deliver like sincerely and honestly what the opposition material was. You break it down to a core claim and you disprove that claim. It is those three steps. Like that is the fundamental basis of refutation as a web speaker. But the way to do it well is you focus on intuitions. So what I do is like I have like 8 or 9 ideas that I speak about I think about quite often in terms of driving certain impacts home. So one argument that I bring quite often to try and help judges understand the impact of something like epistemic access, like so say for instance, on the idea of reparations. So say for instance, we're talking about something that was taken away from a group of people, and now we're saying it was taken away in the past, and now we're trying to provide something in the present to provide reparations, right? We're saying we're going to give you something for something that was taken. Oftentimes this is discussed in the context of things like slavery and colonization. And I found over time, judges were becoming super numb to this idea of reparations. They were not understanding the scale of it. And so I came up with this like idea of like, I was like, how can I convince a judge in terms of refutation that like this is important? And the analogy I came up was that like most people view reparations as like a calculation. You take away three, and so you give back three. But it's actually more abstract than that. Reparations is a concept of stealing, but not in a sense that is easy to quantify. So some people view it as like taking away three and giving back three. But what it is actually is like if you steal someone's like it's like you steal my grandfather's watch. You're not just stealing his watch, you're stealing his ability to tell the time. You're stealing his ability to ground himself in the reality of that moment. And my grandfather would have given me that watch. It's not just that you stole it from my grandfather. In a sense, you stole it from me. You did not steal a watch, you stole the very ability for me to tell time. And in that way, you can really significantly ground why reparations as a concept are significantly more compelling than simply giving someone three because you took away three. And so over time, you will develop these very natural responses for, in debating, maybe I will say we have like 80 ideas we talk about over and over again. And so over time, you will fine tune those ideas and you'll be able to apply that to more situations. So that's how I would answer that question. I'll move to the final question and hopefully then I know I'm running out of time here, but I'll do it really quickly. How do you identify arguments, the main arguments of another team, while trying to weigh your own arguments against them? I have trouble doing them at the same time, especially when the other team is rapping. So I assume when they're speaking fast. The thing I'll say here, quite simply, is that you need to focus on note taking. If the team is going quickly, you having the ability to just note down the ideas and then spending the time through the debate to develop argumentations is the strongest tool for dealing with people who speak quickly. I used to debate a lot against like Matt KIDA when I first moved to the UK, and the reason that I would start to do well against him just because when he spoke, I would not listen to him. I would just. That's how you deal with people who speak really fast. I'm going to stop there for the sake of time, but I just want to thank you guys all for the attendance, and I'm really glad to get this opportunity to chat to your debate community. Hopefully, things go well for you in the future.
All right. Thank you so much, Umar. Thank you everybody as well for participating in today's lecture. The recording will be uploaded on YouTube soon. And again, we would like to say thank you again to Umar for being able to provide us with some really insightful material. With that being said, thank you so much for participating, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.